Welcome back, and I'm very pleased to say that at long last we have finally gotten to the end of all those administrative videos that you needed to get through in the first and second sessions of the course. In here, Classics 395, Greek Myth, Gods, Heroes, and Humans. And thank you very much for having the patience to get through all of those. And now at long last we finally get to the real videos that will deal with Greek mythology from here on out. So you will, of course, get a few other administrative videos from here on out. Such as on the midterm and the final and so forth. But for the most part, which we're talking about here is going to be pertaining to either Greek mythology or in some cases Greek history or culture as pertains to Athens or some other city, such as Rome maybe, as is relevant to the Greek mythology. So again, thank you for getting through all the nitty-gritty stuff. Now we'll actually get to what you really signed up for the course for. Okay, now this is the first video also pertaining to one of your forum assignments. So I should take a moment to review it here again, how the forum assignment and student critique process works so that you understand it. And if you understand it here and do it properly here, you'll just need to duplicate that from this point forward so that you will be okay. So the forum assignments, remember, are going to be discussion questions from the ends of the chapters of the Harris-Platzner textbook. So for instance, there are discussion questions at the end of chapter 1. And student critiques means that you respond to other students' entries on the forums. Now the forums also, of course, later on will include the presentations that you will do for Aeschylus and Sophocles, the tragic playwrights that you're going to read later in the course, and also the one that pertains to the play Medea by Euripides. That also comes up much later. But for right now, you're working with discussion questions at the ends of the chapters. So remember that your assignment is going to include one of the discussion questions at the end of chapter 1 of Harris-Platzner for you to put up on the forum for that session, and then within the same forum also to make a response to one of the other students' chapter 1 discussion question answers. Okay, so be sure that you complete both of those, the discussion questions for chapter 1 and also the student response, and continue doing that each of the sessions as prescribed on the forums and again the calendar and the syllabus when to do those. Okay, so this is the first video that's helping you to answer those discussion questions, and future videos in this course are pertaining to mythology and again sometimes history and culture are meant to aid you in being able to complete those discussion question assignments properly or your presentations later on. Okay, so now let's finally get into the neat stuff of chapter 1. So there is quite a bit, obviously, in chapter 1 that introduces Greek mythology, and I'm not going to cover it too much here. I just want to focus on the subject of one of the discussion questions at the end of the chapter, which is the two gods, Athena and Dionysus. These two show a lot of what is typical of Greek mythology. They're very good introductory examples for the way that Greek mythology works. So as I say, I'll leave it for you to read chapter 1 and see that on how it describes it on its own for the general concept. But seeing this as an example, especially since again it does pertain to your discussion question, I think will be helpful for you. Okay, so let's begin with the goddess Athena. So as you know and can even see from her name, Athena is the patron goddess of Athens. Now she doesn't just become that though. There is actually a contest, as you will read about in chapter 1, between her and her uncle Poseidon, the god of the sea. There is a contest between them to decide which one is going to receive the predominance of the city of Athens. And the two gods try to settle it by offering each a gift to the city. So Poseidon offers a salt spring, which is in fact on the Acropolis, the high mountainous section of Athens, and Athena offers the olive tree. The olive tree is quite important economically for the Athenians because the two main crops that they're able to grow in the surrounding countryside, the territory called Attica, are olives and wine. They're not able to raise a great deal of grain. The land is not fertile enough for that purpose, and a lot of it is rather hilly. But they are able to manufacture olive oil and wine, and then trade it abroad in order to get grain or other necessities that they need. One important thing, of course, that they're able to get is timber later on when they're building their ships. That's going to be a critical thing. So the olive trees growing out in the countryside provide the olives that enable them to make the olive oil that in fact is crucial on many different aspects of Greek life, not only cooking, but also, for instance, the olive oil that athletes use to put on their bodies as they train. So olive oil serves a lot of different purposes, and therefore the Athenians' success at treating olive oil as a cash crop, as it were, is one of the principal reasons why Athena is worshipped as the goddess of the olive branch. So her offer of the olive branch, therefore, comes across as superior to her uncle Poseidon's offer of the salt spring. As a result, Athena receives the patronage. Poseidon, not surprisingly, is furious, and he threatens to flood the entire polis of Athens because he is, after all, the sea god, and he has a terrible temper. So in a tantrum, he's going to flood the city of Athens. Well, obviously, the city of Athens survived, so clearly there was no chance to do the flooding. So what happened? Athena makes a deal with her uncle. She says, if you permit me to retain the patronage of Athens, as I fairly won, the Athenians will also worship you as the sea god, because they will be sailing quite a bit, as in fact happened. And in respect of your wishes to also be included in Athens, the women in Athens will be disallowed from participating in government and voting, since it was probably mostly women who voted for Athena in the first place. So that seems to conciliate with Poseidon, and as a result, the city is spared. And although there wasn't a specific cult worship of Poseidon particularly, he is in fact worshipped at Athens as the sea god, given the fact that the Athenians were very dependent on sea for their political and military successes during their quite long and illustrious history. So okay, so that's how Athena ends up being the patron goddess of Athens. Now, as you read about in the chapter, she has a very unusual birth. So does this guy Dionysus, and we'll get to it shortly. So her birth reflects her wisdom. She is born thanks to a nice, well-placed midwife-style axe chop from Hephaestus, the god of the axe and of metallurgy. She is born out of the head of her father Zeus, who one day has a terrible migraine headache and gives birth to her that way. So that makes her a cranial goddess, and therefore she is full of lots of wisdom. She's not an especially maternal or a ladylike goddess. She never actually gets married with anybody. And Hephaestus actually falls in love with her and goes after her, but she manages to get the sperm off of her, and that actually ends up creating one of the early kings of Athens, who's connected with snakes, as you read about in the text. So she doesn't end up having any real important affairs as such, although there are some myths individually that do relate to how she relates to certain mortals, and usually some mortal ends up not turning out well because of the connection with Athena. But anyway, her birth is unusual, and it does show her closeness with her father, and therefore with the male gender, and also with as I say, cranial ability. So basically wisdom, and especially military strategy. That makes her the war goddess as well as the goddess of wisdom, and the two of them work very closely hand in hand. So at Athens, Athena has a special celebration that's held annually called the Panathenea Festival. There's also the Greater Panathenea that is held every 4 years, and one of the big moments for that involves a special woven garment called a peplos. It's a long woolen garment, a long dress that women wore, that has depicted on it the battle of the gods and the giants, which was one of the major mythological military battles in which Athena participated. So that peplos is brought from the Agora down below the Acropolis up onto the Acropolis, and finally brought into the Parthenon and placed on the statue of Athena. Now, the statue of Athena inside the current Parthenon was the most famous statue of its day. Of course, it's now long since lost. It was, however, not the only statue of Athena on the Acropolis. There was an earlier one called a wooden one called the Athena Promachos. And that we also have references to. We do know where on the Acropolis the original shrine of the Athena Promachos statue would have been included, and that does show that the religious worship that occurred up on the Acropolis well predates the current buildings that are there. And in fact, the Polis of Athens goes all the way back to the 800s BC, but the buildings that are up there were not built until the 400s BC in a very special and important building program undertaken by the Athenian leader Pericles. So Athena, in fact, is long since worshipped, long before her appearance on the Parthenon. And of course, Athena goes all the way back to the Trojan War because, as you may remember, she is one of the three goddesses that competes for that important golden apple. And because she's turned down for it, she ends up being venomously disposed against the Trojans, wanting the Greeks to destroy the Trojans. So that's a separate aspect of her that occurs outside of Athens in that sense. Okay, so Athena is goddess of wisdom, of hardcore mental capacity, military worship, and also the olive tree, and of course her very famous attribute is the owl, representing her wisdom, and it was the owl that was depicted on all those drachmae, the coins for the Athenians. And there was actually a comic saying at one point when all the Athenian allies were required to use drachmas, that owls are flying everywhere all through the Aegean world, representing these owls being depicted on coins that are now being used all around the Aegean world. Okay, so that's Athena. Dionysus, we're going to talk about in later videos when we get to chapter 8. But Dionysus is the really wild wine and theatric god. And he too has a very unusual birth. He actually has a double birth because he is first born out of Semele, after his mother, after she is burned to a crisp by Zeus. The reason for that is that Zeus had, the king of gods, had an illegitimate affair with Semele, a mortal woman, outside of the knowledge of Zeus's wife Hera, and so Hera tricks Semele to get Semele to ask Zeus to show himself in his pure, real form. Zeus tries to get her not to do that, to insist on that, but she insists on it anyway, and so Zeus turns himself into a fireball and burns her. As a result, Dionysus is rescued out of that, out of her corpse, and there are different versions here of exactly what happens, but Dionysus is incorporated into Zeus's body and is born specifically out of his thigh. And as a result, Dionysus is therefore a carnal god because he's born out of the leg of Zeus, out of his body. Now there's another separate story that Dionysus gets torn apart again. In this case, it's once again by Hera's instigation, and it's by the Titans. When he gets all shredded, Zeus is able to rescue his heart, and once again incorporates the heart into his body again to be born once more out of Zeus's body. As a result, Dionysus is manic, and he wanders all over the Greek world and even further east, and he rides on panthers and does all sorts of other crazy wild stuff. And he's also intoxicated all the time, so that makes him even more mad. And he also can disturb society quite a bit, as we'll talk about later when we get to that part of Harris-Platzner. Because of his wildness and his capacity to be many different kinds of characters at once, he's actually an ideal god for the theater. So the City Dionysia Festival held at Athens is the annual one for theatrics, and it's where plays are produced, both tragedies and comedies, in competition, as we'll talk about later when we read the tragic playwrights' plays. And Dionysus is therefore worshipped at that. So his connection with theater is partly because of his manic spirit, where he can actually change identity quite a bit and even hide who he actually is, just like you would do with a mask in the theater, and also because he himself is the object of tragedy because he's torn apart and put back together again, just like metaphorically a tragic hero could in fact be torn apart and sometimes even physically torn apart because he tries too hard to stick to a certain point of view or gets hubristic We'll talk about that later. And it becomes excessive in his way of thinking, and ultimately suffers tragic consequences. So you have Athena and Dionysus with very different kinds of births, but both of them with very odd supernatural births that reflect the way that Greek mythology works. It's like they're both human but not human at the same time. And you'll find this valence happening all the time, this conflict within the Greek gods. They're almost supernaturally human, and at the same time, they're almost too human. Emotionally, especially in terms of maturity, they're very human, as you will see quite a bit when we get to chapter 6. Okay, so that's what you need. Some things you need to know about Athena and Dionysus, and that should help you with that discussion question. And there's obviously quite a bit more to get in chapter 1, so make sure you've got that straight. And in our next videos after this, we'll be moving on to chapter 2. So looking forward to seeing you again at the next video.